Good morning, crime community. Happy Valentine's Day. Better late than never. I'm going to show a Valentine's book. Is that a lovely Valentine's book? The Love Letters of Elizabeth Barrett and Robert Browning. The love affair between two of the Victorian era's most famous poets is one of passion, tragedy, illness, and ultimately endurance. Collected here for a first time in print are a selection from the first 6 months of the couple's courtship, which captures their first meeting, their blossoming love, and hints at their forbidden marriage. Archived at Wesley College since 1930, these love letters are a fascinating glimpse into the lives of their famous literary pair, a perfect gift for newlyweds, literary lovers, and the romantic dreamers in your life. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, 1806 to 1861, was one of the most prominent poets of the Victorian era. Her poetry was widely popular in both England and the United States during her lifetime. Robert Browning, 1812 to 1889, was one of the most foremost Victorian poets and playwrights. There's so much controversy about all these poets, you don't even know where to begin. We left off with Poe before, and we're going to skip by Miss Amelia Welby. We get to a chapter called Elizabeth Barrett. So why is Poe making fun of Miss Browning? He's making fun of her because of her marriage. That if you got married in the 19th century, you were in deep shit. Okay, so both Elizabeth Barrett and Robert Browning both got divorced their original relations to marry each other. So that's why it's considered controversial. So now Poe's calling her Elizabeth Barrett. What is he, one of the English aristocratic elite who came to America? And then they decided that they were going to be the industrial elitist of America, as opposed to the broad masses of what Poe talks about, reaching the intelligent reader, which is what you guys are. It's who I try to read to every day, intelligent readers, so that we don't end up knocking our critics of America, because I have some provenance going on here with the Library of London in Edinburgh. National Library of London in Edinburgh is the most famous library in the world. They've already done the research on 2 of my books, and they're still ignoring me. So I don't know what's wrong with these people, but I have a book here that not only do I have a book that was signed by Lord Byron, the most famous poet in the world who went to Oxford. They burned his books. I have his students' books that they're not interested in. I also have one of the teachers of Oxnard who was given a gift of like a law degree as a gift on Browning. And we didn't know they were burning Shelley's books and Byron's books. And Washington and Jefferson and Hamilton were going to school at Oxford at the same time. So I don't know what's going on with Oxford. Are they standing up for the old Byron, who's for the old school? Are they trying to stand up for the new Byron, the revolutionary Byron that created America? So this is why it's a little bit confusing. So I don't know where to begin with Elizabeth Barrett Browning, since Poe is like putting her down. Here's a book by Elizabeth Barrett Browning called Aurora Leigh. This is her most famous work. This whole book is one poem. Can you imagine? This whole book is one poem. So, you know, let's just read a little bit of the introduction of Aurora Leigh. It's edited by Carrie McSweeney, because I have no idea what I'm doing here. Aurora Leigh. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, born in 1806, was the eldest of 12 children of her heir to the Jamaican plantation fortune. She grew up in her family estate at Hertfordshire, where from an early age she read widely, studied Greek, and wrote poetry. From 1821, she was in delicate health, living for prolonged periods as a near invalid. She moved with her family to London in 1835. By the time she met Robert Browning 10 years later, she had been published poets for 25 years and had gained a considerable reputation. Her love affair with Browning is recorded in the voluminous correspondence of 1845 and 1846 and her sonnets from the Portuguese published in 1850. Despite her father's interdiction, she married Browning in 1846. The couple immediately left for the continent, eventually settling in Florence, where her only child was born in 1849. Casa Guidi Windows and Poems Before Congress reflect her intense involvement in Italian life and politics. Aurora Leigh, her major poetic achievement, was finally completed and published in 1856. Barrett Browning died in Florence in 1861 and was buried in the Protestant cemetery there. Carrie McSweeney is Molson Professor of English at McGill University in Montreal. His publications include Tennyson and Subwine and Romantic Naturalists, and on and on and on and on. Several acknowledgments, contents. Aurora Leigh is written in 9 volumes. I'm just going to read a little bit of the introduction to Aurora Leigh. This is the introduction. In the 1840s and 1850s, English poets and critics were much concerned with the question of the proper subject matter of poetry with the relationship of poetry to contemporary life. In 1842, for example, John Sterling complained on the Quarterly Review that little has been done towards a poetic representation of our time. Early in the century, there had been the narrative poems of George Crabbe and Byron's Don Juan, that splendid attempt at a creative survey of modern life. But while the early Victorian age was full of great, through conflicting energies and seen with high feelings, so far no poetic mind had found in this huge, harassed, and luxurious national existence the nourishment, not the poison, of creative art. The possibilities were immense. Sterling claimed that there were no telling what poetry might be in the time and land if a man was of the highest powers and most complete cultivation exercised the art among us. Matthew Arnold, on the other hand, felt that poetry and contemporary life were immiscible. In 1849, he urged his friend Arthur Hugh Clow to reflect, in spite of all nonsense, some people talk, how deeply unpoetical the age and all one's surroundings are. Not unprofound and unground, not unmoving, but unpoetical. My dearest Clow, these are the damnedest times. Everything is against one. The height to which knowledge is come and spread of luxury, our physical innervation and absence of great natures, the avoid contact with millions of small ones, newspapers, cities, light profligate, friends, moral desperados like Carlyle, of our own selves and the sickening consequences of our difficulties. It is in his preface of Poems, 1853, Arnold quoted a particular example of the nonsense some people talk, the opinion of a periodical critic that the poet who would really fix the public attention must leave the exhausted past, draw his subjects from matters of present import, and therefore, before of interest and novelty, Arnold branded his view of completely false, but despite his exhortations, his friend were not sure. So in the same year, Clow observed in a review article, principally concerned with Arnold's own metrical compositions, that while poems after classical models, poems from Oriental successes and the like, have undoubtedly a great literary value, there is no question it is plain and patent enough that people much prefer Vanity Fair and Bleak House for poetry to be widely popular, to gain the ear of multitudes. Clow thought it would have to deal more than at present it usually does with general wants, ordinary feelings, and obvious rather than the rare facts of human nature, the actual palpable things with which our everyday life is concerned. The two principal poets of the period reacted in different ways to the debate. Robert Browning stayed in Italy both physically and imaginatively and did not heed the plea that Charles Kingsley made in 1850 that he leave the effete and enervated land and cast all his rugged genial force into the questions and the struggles of the mother country, to whom he owes all of his most valuable characteristics. Tennyson, on the other hand, made several extremely interesting efforts to accommodate his poetic gifts to contemporary subject matter. His English Idylls, published in poems, The Princess, his book's length medley of the women question, and his monodrama, Maud. Younger poets made equally energetic attempts to represent aspects of the age. Clouds, the both of Popper, La Foniche, and Amours de Voyage, Coventry's Patamore, The Angels of the House, and George Meredith's Modern Love. The most ambitious effort was made not by a younger poet, but by a man. It was made by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who was Tennyson's senior by 3 years, and her husband's by 6 years. We're going to go to chapter 2. Given the circumstances of her life, one would hardly have expected Barrett Browning to be the person to supply the fullest poetical representation of the early Victorian age. Her childhood and adolescence has been passed on her family estate in Hertfordshire, and from her 16th year, illness had caused her to live in a semi-invalid. One of her early letters to Robert Browning, written in March 1845, shows that she was keenly aware of the disadvantages of her position. I have lived only inwardly before this seclusion of my illness. I was secluded still, and there are few of the youngest women in the world who have not seen more, heard more, known more of society than I, who am scarcely to be called young now. I grew up in the country, not so social opportunities, had my heart in books and poetry, and my experience in reveries. And do you also know what a disadvantage this ignorance is to my art? Why, if I live on and yet do not escape from this seclusion, you do not perceive that I labor under signal disadvantages, that I am in the manner as a blind poet? Certainly, this is a compensation to a degree. I have had much of the inner life, and from the habit of self-consciousness, of self-analysis, I make great guesses as to human nature into the main, and how willingly I would, as a poet, exchange some of this lumbering, ponderous, helpless knowledge of books and some experience of life of man. No wonder that her poetic output during the previous quarter century had been untinged by contemporary life and had drawn both its inspiration and its subject matter from books and reveries. Her poetic debut was The Battle of Marathon, a 4-book epic in the manner of Pope's translations of Homer, privately printed in 1820 when she was only 14 years old. She was followed 6 years later by an essay in mind, the model this time being Pope's Essay on Man, a translation of Achilles' Prometheus Bound, appeared in 1833, followed by 5 years later by The Seraphim and other poems. The volume filled with angels, wandering souls, proud knights, and lovelorn maidens, and included a preface describing the contents as religious in their general character, and the author as feelings intensely and sublimes use of poetry and the solemn responsibilities of the poet. The title poem was in 2 parts. The scene was the first, was the outer side of the shut heavenly gates, that of the second, mid-air above Judea. The second volume, Poems of 1844, offered more of the same. The collection, Principal Poems, a Drama of Exile, was described by Edgar Allan Poe. You see how we've already cross-referenced these books? As a melody of metaphysical recitatives sung out of tune at Adam and Eve by all manner of inconceivable abstractions. As for Eve, the central character, she is a metaphysical something or nothing, enwrapped in a fog of rhapsody about transfiguration and the seed and the bruising of the heel, and other talk of the nature that no man ever pretended to understand in plain prose. 2 of the 1844 poems, however, did point to a new direction. Railways are mentioned in Lady Geraldine's Courtship, a romance of the age, as they are its model, Tennyson and Lochley's Hall. And while the cry of the children is worked up from books, the books are parliamentary reports concerning the employment of children in the mines and factories of early Victorian England. The movement away from reverie and towards the contemporary world was greatly accelerated by Elizabeth's love affair with Robert Browning. which culminated in their marriage in 1846. And in the beginning of the new life in Italy, Barrett Browning has finally escaped from the seclusion. She was able to replace reveries with personal experience and observations, and to break away completely from the pedantic study of false models that Poe had identified as the principal contaminant of her happy audacity of thought and expression, never before known in one of her sex. Sonnets from the Portuguese, for example, which was written in 1845 and 6, is a generically innovative work that comes directly out of intense personal experience and displays a self-conscious awareness of its freshness. I had lived with the visions of my company instead of men and women, Casa Guidi Guido, and a poem of modern impressions of contemporary life, albeit the life of Tuscany and the political situation where, and Aurora Leigh, her next major effort and principal poetic achievement, is both a penetrating study of the inner life of the 19th century woman and a vividly colored representation of the age. We're going to read one more chapter, chapter 3. Even before she met her future husband, Barrett Browning had begun to think about writing a long poem comprehending the aspect of the manner of modern life and flinching at nothing of its conventional. After all, she reflected in October of 1844, a true poetical novel, modern and on the level of the manners of the day, may be as good a poem as any other, and much more popular besides. Later that year, she continued her ruminations. People care for a story, there's the truth. There is the obstacle to making an interesting a story of a poem as of a prose work, conversations of events that may not be given as rapidly, as passionately and lucidly in verse as in prose. You see, nobody is offended by my approach to the conventions of vulgar life in Lady Geraldine, and it gives me the courage to go on and touch this real everyday life of our age and hold it with my two hands. I want to write a poem of a new class, in a measure, a Don Juan without the mockery and impurity under one aspect, and having unity as a work of art, and admitting as much philosophical dreaming and digression, which is in fact a characteristic of the age, as I would like to use. In the winter of 1844 and 5, Barrett Browning had an intention, but she did not yet have a plan. She first needed a story which she had to be her own devising, that she could develop as she liked. A few characters, a simple story, a plenty of room for passion and thought. That is what I want, and am not likely to find easily. This proved to be the case. It was only in early 1853 that she had a story in hand and was able to begin composing. The poem I am about, she wrote in April of that year, will fill a volume when done, and it is written in blank verse, in the autobiographical form. The heroine, the artist woman, not a painter mind. It is intensely modern, crammed with the times, not the Times newspaper as far as my strength will allow. The story she devised is indeed simple and concerns only a few characters. Aurora Leigh, the first-person narrator, recounts her development as a person and a poet from birth to her age of 30. Her early life is spent in Italy. She loses her Italian mother at the age of 4 and is 13 when her English father dies, and she is sent back to England to live in the country with her utterly unconventional aunt. On her 12th birthday, she is proposed to by her cousin Romney Lee, heir to the family estates, who urges her to give up her poetic ambitions and join him in fighting the evils of the age. She refuses his offer, and claiming for herself as a woman an equal right of vocational fulfillment, and insisting that the poet's work is at least as important to society as the reformers. After her aunt's death, Aurora moves to London to live on a small legacy and make her way to the literary world. Some years later, she is visited by Lady Waldemere, who asks her help in preventing Romney, whom Lady Waldemere wants to herself from marrying a seamstress named Marion Erlisle, as a way of calling attention to the need to bridge the chasm between the rich and the poor. Aurora visits Marion's slum dwelling and learns the unfortunate young woman's life story. In their wedding day, Marion leaves Romney waiting at the altar and despairs. 2 years later, Aurora, now a successful poet, decides to return to Italy. En route, she lingers in Paris when she becomes upon Marion and her baby and learns of her recent misadventures. She takes the unwed mother and her child with her to Italy, and the three live quietly outside Florence until the arrival of Romney, who is much changed by the failure of his socialist schemes, participates in the resolution of the plot. Strictly speaking, Barrett Browning's story may be said to be her own, but it is only to be expected that a major work by so bookish an author would have a considerable number of intertextual connections with antecedent works, both poems and prose fictions. The former include Don Juan, which Barrett Browning herself cited as a precedent, and two poems of Tennyson's, though they were more important as stimuli or negative exempla, them as models. Locksley Hall, 1842, was passionate and full, but there is no story, no manners, no modern illusion, except in the grand general adjuration of the mother age. As for the princess, in the letters of January 1846, Barrett Browning reported to the News that Tennyson is writing a new poem. He has fashioned the second book of it, and it is in the blank verse and in a fairy tale, and called The University. The university members being all females. I don't know what to think. It makes me open my eyes. Now, isn't the world too old and fond of steam for blank verse poems and ever so many books to be written on the fairies? It is inevitable that when she read the finished poem, she would profess herself to be a good deal disappointed. But while Barrett Browning was let down by Tennyson's fascination, she could hardly have failed to notice that the princess explored the relation of sexual love and marriage and the nurturing of children to the intellectual and vocational aspirations of 19th century women, and that Tennyson's views on the subject were in essential agreement with her own. Another important poetic presupposition was Wordsworth, the Prelude, his book-length autobiographical account in blank verse of the growth of a poet's mind and imagination from childhood to maturity. At the beginning of Aurora Leigh, the Wordsworthian point of reference is signaled by Barrett Browning's appropriation of the powerful image of the ninth section of Wordsworth's Immortality Ode, the human life cycle as a journey inland from the shores of the Atlantic infinited, in which the adult traveler remains a felt sense. Both Prelude and Aurora Leigh tell the early loss of first the mother and then the father, of the substitution of the natural bond of the maternal one, of early poetic aspirations and self-doubts, and then of the growing assurance of vocation. Both details the failure of radical hopes for the social reform, and both end with their subjects, now in the fourth decade, reaffirming their faith in poetry as a force for good in individual human lives. There are, to be sure, significant differences between Wordsworth's male and Barrett Browning's female Kungsleder woman. The emphasis on the latter, on the poet's dependence on human love, for example, has no parallel in the Prelude account of the development of the poet, who was early taught to feel perhaps too much, a self-sufficing power of solitude. But this and other features of Barrett Browning's Prelude come into sharper forces when viewed through the lenses of Wordsworth's antecedent text. When she searched English poetry history for female antecedents, Barrett Browning was forced to lament, "I look everywhere for grandmothers and see none." Interview Joanna Ballet, 1762 to 1851, was the first female poet in all senses in England. Barrett Browning was a sensitive and discriminating reader of the two principal female poets of the next generation, Felicia Hemans, 1793 through 1835, and Letitia Elizabeth Landon, 1802 through 38. While both these writers influenced her thinking and the distinctive vocal and emotional vicissitudes of the female poet, neither work was helpful in her attempt to write a long poem of a new class. What was extremely helpful was the work of a number of 19th century female novelists. Jane Austen, however, was not one of them, for reasons that are indicative of the idolizing propensities of Barrett Browning's high Victorian aesthetic, even when the artistic medium is realistic. She is perfect in what she attempts, but the excellence lies, I do hold, rather in the execution than the aspiration. It is a narrow, earthly, and essential unpoetical view of life. It is the only half a true view. her human creature never look up, and when they look up within, it is not deeply conventional life, is not an inward life, and a writer who is not one-sided must comprehend both in his view of humanity. Jane Austen is one-sided, and her side is the inferior and darker side, God, nature, and soul. What does she say or suggest of these? Madame de Staël, Corinne, 1807, which she had read 3 times by her mid-20s, was much more to Barrett Browning's taste. These are close similarities between Aurora Leigh and de Staël's digressive, idea-laden novel, in which it has been said the modern woman makes her first appearance in literature, both in an Italian mother and a British father. Corinne lives in Italy until early adolescence, when she is taken into a country house in England where she is taught to a conventional gentlewoman and where she comes to realize that her vocation is to be an artist. Later in the novel, she returns to Italy in sorrow. Like Aurora, she lives in the country outside Florence, brooding on her knowledge, in her case not erroneous, that someone she cares for deeply has married someone else. The novel of George Sand is also favorite reading material, and not without reason did one of the reviewers of Aurora Leigh complain that her heroine had been made to resemble too closely some of the female portraits of the French novelist. In Consuelo, for example, which Barrett Browning described as a sort of rambling odyssey, a female odyssey, if you like. The title character is a woman artist who has eloquently insisted on her right to liberty as a condition of her art. And there were novels of Charlotte Bronte, Jane Eyre, and Villette, who both admired by Barrett Browning, and anyone familiar with the former will not fail to be struck by the resemblances between Romney Lee and St. John Rivers, and by the fact that Romney is made to suffer the fates of both Rivers' rejection and Rochester's blinding. There are also intertextual connections between Aurora Leigh and the novel that makes what may be called Barrett Browning's literary fathers and brothers. Chief among them was Balzac, a writer with most wonderful facility, with an overflow of life everywhere, and with the vision and the utterance of a great seer. What else, she remarked, by the author of La Cousin Pons, could have taken such a subject, one of the lowest mud of humanity, and glorified and consecrated it? Another French novelist she much admired was Eugene Sue, who Les Mires de Paris, read for the second time in the early 1850s, was a work of genius and power despite its extravagance and impurities, and from those virtuous heroine essential features of Marian Earle seem to have been drawn, and she was impressed by the fiction of Edward Bulwer Lytton, whose splendid, earnest Mile Travelers was a story of the present day, having as its author explained the philosophical design of a moral education or apprenticeship, and exploiting the recognition that so much nor hitherto that might be conveyed the advantage through the lips or in the life of an imaginary writer of our time. During the composition of Aurora Leigh, which extended from the late winter of 1853 to the summer of 1856, Barrett Browning struggled to amalgamate her diverse materials to control the centrifugal tendencies of her imagination and to accommodate thematic imperatives that became insistent during the process of composition. The intensity of her engagement is insistence in the letter of March 1855. Between 5,000 or 6,000 lines were written, and more still to write. Blank verse, why not? An autobiography of a poetess, not me opposing the practical or the ideal lives and showing how the practical and real, so-called, is but the eternal evolution of the ideal and spiritual. Is it from inner to outer, and whether from life, morals, or art, a good deal in this relation upon the social question, and against the socialist, a good deal, in fact, about everything in the world and beyond, taken from the Times, hot and hot. I rather took fright at Dickens' Hard Times, as Robert told me from a review. We neither of us have seen the book, that it is treated of an opposition of the real and ideal, but upon consideration I took breath and courage, because it is impossible that Dickens and I could walk precisely the same ground. If we did, there would be still Badger's Foot and orangutans distinct enough The devil, you say, don't. I believe my book will be clear enough and alive enough, even if the story will be wanting in rapidity. There are characters, talks. And in February 1856, she reported herself to be in a plague of industry. It's a sort of furial as she struggled to finish the enormous work into which she had put so much of myself, of my soul, my thoughts, my emotions, and opinions. That is the first 3 chapters of the introduction to Aurora Leigh. That was by Professor Carrie McSweeney. My question would be to Edgar Allan Poe. I guess we will finish this up on another day. Why he's writing, this is a long verse he's written about Miss Barrett. This is about 30 pages or so that Poe wrote about Miss Barrett. Why he's calling her Elizabeth Barrett. I guess he's not too happy with her work. But we're going to get into that, what Poe says about Elizabeth Barrett, because she had an unconventional marriage. Who today doesn't have an unconventional marriage? Can you tell me one person? Oh, they were married for 50 years and they were so happy. They had 15 children and they lived happy ever after for eternity. Have a wonderful, happy Valentine's Day to all the fans, families, and children, all the psychopaths, all my friends and enemies and wives and children, and God bless them all.